Hi guys, imagine this. You open your eyes, not in your soft bed with Netflix waiting for you later, but in a dark, drafty little room in Tudor England. The first thing you notice isn't the morning sunlight, it's the smell. A mix of wood, damp straw, and sewage. Yup, welcome to your new life. Your bed is basically a sack stuffed with straw. And no, it hasn't been changed in months. It crackles when you move, and you can actually hear tiny scratching sounds inside, probably rats or fleas. That soft blanket you love back home, forget it. Here you've got a rough wool cloth that smells like sweat and smoke. Now, normally, in 2025, the first thing you'd reach for is coffee, right? Well, bad news, there's no coffee. Instead, your morning drink is a weak sour ale. Yes, beer for breakfast. And not the fancy kind either. Just cloudy, lukewarm, slightly gross ale. Why? Because the water is so dirty, it could kill you, faster than anything else. So unless you're into starting your day buzzed and mildly depressed, you're not gonna like it here. And let's talk bathrooms. Or the complete lack of them. There's no toilet. Just a bucket in the corner of the room, and when it's full, someone might dump it into the street. Maybe. Which means yes, you're sleeping, eating, and living surrounded by that smell. Think your messy roommate back home is bad. Tudor England just humbled you. And don't even think about entertainment. No TikTok, no Netflix, not even a bookend. Lest you're one of the tiny percent of people who can actually read. Most likely, you'll be staring at a wall, scratching flea bites, and wondering if you'll make it to dinner without catching the plague dot by the time 20 minutes have passed. You're hungry, dirty, itchy, and already at risk of catching something fatal. And this is just the start of your day, so stick around, because surviving even 24 hours in Tudor Britain, trust me, you won't make it. Morning life and survival alright. So you've somehow survived the first 5 minutes of waking up. In Tudor England, congratulations. Most modern people would have already raged quit by now, but you're tougher than that. Or maybe just unlucky enough to still be alive. Either way, let's see how your morning goes. Spoiler, it's not great. The first thing you'll notice after getting out of bed is just how bitterly cold it is. Tudor homes didn't come with central heating, insulation, or even decent windows. The glass, if you were rich enough to afford it, was cloudy and warped. For everyone else, just wooden shutters that barely kept out the wind. Which means in winter, the inside of your house feels only slightly less freezing than the outside. You'd be wrapped up in layer after layer of rough, itchy wool just to stop your fingers turning blue. And if you're a peasant, forget about cozy pajamas most likely. You just slept in the same clothes you wore all day. Now let's talk hygiene. And honestly, hygiene might be too generous a word here. You don't wake up and brush your teeth. You don't hop in the shower. In fact, you probably haven't bathed in weeks, maybe months. And brushing your teeth, no such thing. Toothpaste won't exist for centuries. Instead, mouths are full of rotting teeth, bad breath, and gums that bleed if you so much as look at them funny. You think morning breath today is bad. Imagine an entire country that smells like it every single day. And yes, fleas. They're everywhere. You scratch at your arms, your neck, your hair, and no matter what, you can't escape them. Lice live in your clothing. Rats scuttle around the floor at night, and bedbugs make sure you never get a proper night's sleep. Don't let the bedbugs bite wasn't just a cute little rhyme, it was your daily reality. Alright, so maybe you're thinking, okay, I'll just wash up. Nice try. Water is rarely clean, baths are expensive, and people actually believed that bathing too often made you sick. Yep, if you were lucky, you might freshen up by rubbing your face and hands with a cloth. Maybe you'd change your underclothes, if you even owned a spare set, but most people didn't, which means you've been living, eating, and sweating in the same outfit for weeks. Speaking of outfits, fashion wasn't exactly comfortable. If you're a peasant, it's wool, and more wool. Scratchy, heavy, and hot in summer, but still somehow not warm enough in winter. If you're upper class, you might get linen shirts and fancy doublets. But those come with their own problems, layers so tight you can barely breathe. Corsets for women, and clothing so valuable you couldn't even wash it. The rich basically stank just as much as the poor, only with silk and velvet covering up the smell. And now, it's time for breakfast. Sounds nice, right? Wrong. Forget your cereal, toast, or eggs. In Tudor England, breakfast wasn't really a thing. If you were poor, You might get a crust of stale bread, maybe dipped in weak ale. If you were lucky, a bit of cheese. No fruit smoothies, no oat milk lattes, just bread hard enough to chip a tooth and a drink that tastes like disappointment. Richer people might have something extra: meat, pies, porridge, maybe some fruit, but let's be honest, you're probably not rich, which means you're starting your day already hungry, already dirty, and already wondering if dying young might not be such a bad idea after all. And remember that bucket from earlier, the one in the corner of your room? Well, if you're unlucky, it's your turn to empty it, which means carrying it outside and dumping it in the street. And when I say the street, what I really mean is an open sewer where everyone else's waste is also flowing. So, congratulations, you've just stepped outside into a world that smells like a giant toilet. The cobblestones are slick with filth. Pigs and stray dogs are rooting around in the muck, and you're desperately trying not to slip. Forget the treadmill, just balancing on a Tudor street without falling into something disgusting is today's workout. And here's the kicker: everything around you is already dangerous. The smoke from your fireplace fills the house because chimneys are rare and ventilation is terrible. The streets spread disease faster than you can say plague. Even your own breakfast could kill you, depending on how moldy the bread was. You wanted to survive one day in Tudor England. Well, you haven't even made it past morning yet, and you're already on hard mode. So, you've managed to choke down your breakfast of stale bread and sad watery ale. Congratulations, still alive, but don't relax just yet, because now it's time to actually start your day. And spoiler, the real suffering is only just beginning. If you're a peasant, and let's be real, most people, where your morning doesn't mean scrolling on your phone or checking emails. It means work. Hard, backbreaking, no breaks. Work. Maybe you're trudging into the fields at sunrise, hoe in hand, trying to coax some stubborn crops out of the frozen ground. Or maybe you're tending livestock, feeding pigs, mucking out stalls, trying not to get trampled by cows that don't care if you're having a bad day. Forget ergonomic chairs and air conditioning. This is bending over in the mud for hours, rain or shine, all while praying your landlord doesn't raise taxes again. And if you're a woman, double the suffering. You're not just cooking and cleaning, you're spinning thread, mending clothes, hauling water, and looking after children who are probably coughing up their lungs thanks to the latest plague. Remember, there's no running water, so fetching water means walking to a well or river, filling a heavy bucket, and carrying it all the way home. Do that 3 or 4 times, and you've basically done the Tudor version of CrossFit. Meanwhile, if you're part of the upper classes, things look easier on the surface, but don't be fooled. Sure, you're not shoveling manure at sunrise. Instead, you're suffocating in stiff, heavy clothing while servants lace you up so tightly you can barely breathe. Breakfast might be better, maybe some meat pies, maybe a sweet roll, but don't think you're safe. Rich people had their own problems: gout from eating too much meat, rotten teeth from feasting on sugar, and constant paranoia about poison. Honestly, sometimes being rich just meant you got to die more expensively. Now, let's talk about the streets, because at some point, you're going to have to go outside. And trust me, you don't want to. Imagine the worst alleyway you've ever seen now. Multiply the filth by 10. Raw sewage runs down the gutters, pigs and dogs root through garbage, and every now and then, someone tosses the contents of a chamber pot right out the window. If you're not watching where you step, congratulations, you've just ruined your shoes. Not that they were good shoes anyway. Most peasants wore rough leather boots or just wooden clogs. Some even went barefoot. And the ground, mud, manure, and mystery liquids you don't want to think too hard about. Oh, and did I mention the diseases? Because everywhere you go, death is just waiting to catch you. The plague still pops up now and then, wiping out whole families. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox, take your pick. Even a tiny cut on your hand could kill you, because there are no antibiotics. And if you do get sick, good luck. Doctors of the time thought the cure for almost everything was either bleeding you with leeches, or making you drink some disgusting herbal potion. In other words, getting treated might actually make things worse. And if the diseases don't get you, the justice system might. Tudor England was not exactly forgiving. Maybe you're accused of stealing bread, or maybe you said something bad about the king. Either way, punishments are brutal. Stocks in the town square, public whippings, even executions. And remember, this is the morning routine. You're out buying bread one minute, and the next, you're watching someone lose their head for treason. Think your morning commute is stressful. Try walking past a public hanging on your way to work. But let's rewind to your daily chores. By mid-morning, you're already exhausted. If you're a farmer, you've been out in the fields since dawn. Your back aching, hands blistered. If you're a housewife, you're trying to bake bread in a smoky, cramped kitchen with no oven timer and no clue if it's actually cooked through. And if you're a child, forget cartoons, you're already working too. Maybe as an apprentice, maybe as a servant, maybe just running errands all day. Childhood as we know it didn't exist. Kids were basically tiny adults with fewer rights and a higher chance of dying before age 5. So, let's do a quick recap of your Tudor morning. You've woken up itchy, dirty, and freezing. You've eaten food that barely counts as food. You've emptied a bucket of waste into the street and hoped it didn't splash back on you. You've worked harder in 3 hours than most modern people do in a week. You've risked disease, punishment, and humiliation all before noon. And the worst part, this isn't a bad day. This is a normal day. So next time you hit snooze on your alarm, just remember, at least you're not waking up in Tudor England. Alright, so you've made it to lunchtime in Tudor England, and you're probably starving, because your breakfast was basically a sad piece of bread dipped in disappointment. So, what's for lunch? Well, brace yourself. First, let's deal with the elephant in the room. Food safety. Spoiler alert, there isn't any. No refrigerators, no freezers, no plastic wrap. If food goes bad, people often just scrape off the mold and keep eating. Imagine leaving a pot of stew sitting on the counter for 3 days and then thinking, still good. That's Tudor cuisine in a nutshell. Bread was the backbone of the Tudor diet, but not the fluffy, warm, golden loaf you're picturing. No, we're talking about coarse, gritty bread, baked with whatever flour was available. Sometimes it was mixed with ground-up beans, peas, or even sawdust if grain was scarce, and because the flour wasn't properly sifted, the bread often contained tiny bits of stone from the mill. Congratulations, your daily meal also comes with free dental damage. Dentists didn't really exist, by the way, so one cracked tooth could mean months of agony. Now, let's talk about meat. Sounds good, right? Everyone loves meat. But in Tudor England, unless you were rich, you barely got any. And if you did, it was probably salted, dried, or smoked to preserve it, which means by the time it reached your plate, it was tough, chewy, and salty enough to make you chug a gallon of ale. Fresh meat was a luxury. Poor families might go weeks without tasting it, and when they did, it could easily make them sick. If it hadn't been cooked properly, or if it was just plain rotten. Speaking of ale, say goodbye to clean drinking water. Water sources were usually contaminated with sewage, animal waste, or just plain filth. Drinking from a river or well could be a death sentence, which is why almost everyone, even children, drank ale. But don't get too excited, it wasn't the strong, crisp beer you're imagining. It was weak, cloudy, sour, and about as enjoyable as licking the inside of an old barrel. Kids as young as 5 drank it daily, because at least it wouldn't kill them as fast as the water, and if you were lucky enough to be rich, well then you had wine. But don't picture a fine bottle of Merlot. Tudor wine was often imported, spoiled during the journey, and then fixed by mixing it with spices, or honey to mask the taste. Basically, if you had money, you were drinking fancy-flavored vinegar. Now, let's not forget dairy. Milk went bad almost immediately, so it was usually turned into butter or cheese, and even then, the cheese was often hard, crumbly, and sour. Forget smooth cheddar or creamy brie cheddar. Cheese was more like a survival ration than a delicacy. Butter, if you could get it, was often yellow with clumps in it, and the taste, let's just say it didn't exactly scream farm fresh. And here's the kicker, everything could kill you. Rye bread might contain a fungus called ergot, which caused hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes death. Meat might carry parasites. Fish, if not salted enough, could rot in days. Even vegetables weren't safe because farmers used, well, human waste as fertilizer. So yeah, when you sat down for a nice leafy salad, you were basically eating disease with dressing. So, by the time you've had your midday meal, you're full but you're also in danger. Every bite is a gamble. Will it keep you alive, or will it send you to an early grave? The suspense is real, and you didn't even get dessert. Food and drink danger's alright, so you've made it to lunchtime in Tudor England, and you're probably starving, because your breakfast was basically a sad piece of bread dipped in disappointment. So, what's for lunch? Well, brace yourself. First, let's deal with the elephant in the room. Food safety. Spoiler alert, there isn't any. No refrigerators, no freezers, no plastic wrap. If food goes bad, people often just scrape off the mold and keep eating. Imagine leaving a pot of stew sitting on the counter for 3 days and then thinking, hey, still good. That's Tudor cuisine in a nutshell. Bread was the backbone of the Tudor diet, but not the fluffy, warm, golden loaf you're picturing. No, we're talking about coarse, gritty bread baked with whatever flour was available. Sometimes it was mixed with ground-up beans, peas, or even sawdust if grain was scarce. And because the flour wasn't properly sifted, the bread often contained tiny bits of stone from the mill. Congratulations, your daily meal also comes with free dental damage. Dentists didn't really exist, by the way. So, one cracked tooth could mean months of agony. Now, let's talk about meat. Sounds good, right? Everyone loves meat. But in Tudor England, unless you were rich, you barely got any. And if you did, it was probably salted, dried, or smoked to preserve it, which means by the time it reached your plate, it was tough, chewy, and salty enough to make you chug a gallon of ale. Fresh meat was a luxury. Poor families might go weeks without tasting it, and when they did, it could easily make them sick, if it hadn't been cooked properly, or if it was just plain rotten. Speaking of ale, say goodbye to clean drinking water. Water sources were usually contaminated with sewage, animal waste, or just plain filth. Drinking from a river or well could be a death sentence, which is why almost everyone, even children, drank ale. But don't get too excited, it wasn't the strong, crisp beer you're imagining. It was weak, cloudy, sour, and about as enjoyable as licking the inside of an old barrel. Kids as young as 5 drank it daily, because at least it wouldn't kill them as fast as the water dot, and if you were lucky enough to be rich, well, then you had wine. But don't picture a fine bottle of Merlot. Tudor wine was often imported, spoiled during the journey, and then fixed by mixing it with spices or honey to mask the taste. Basically, if you had money, you were drinking fancy flavored vinegar. Now, let's not forget dairy. Milk went bad almost immediately, so it was usually turned into butter or cheese. And even then, the cheese was often hard, crumbly, and sour. Forget smooth cheddar or creamy Brittada. Cheese was more like a survival ration than a delicacy. Butter, if you could get it, was often yellow with clumps in it, and the taste, let's just say it didn't exactly scream farm fresh. And here's the kicker, everything could kill you. Rye bread might contain a fungus called ergot, which caused hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes death. Meat might carry parasites. Fish, if not salted enough, could rot in days. Even vegetables weren't safe because farmers used human waste as fertilizer. So yeah, when you sat down for a nice leafy salad, you were basically eating disease, with dressing. So, by the time you've had your midday meal, you're full but you're also in danger. Every bite is a gamble. Will it keep you alive, or will it send you to an early grave? The suspense is real, and you didn't even get dessert. Alright, so let's say you've survived lunch. Somehow, you didn't crack a tooth, choke on mold, or catch dysentery from your salad. Good job. But now it's evening, and guess what? It's time to eat again. Spoiler, it's not going to get any better. Dinner in Tudor England depended heavily on class. If you were poor, it looked exactly like lunch. More bread, more ale, maybe a thin potager, watery stew made from barley, peas, or whatever scraps were lying around. Think of it as the sad ancestor of soup. It was filling, sure, but also bland, repetitive, and likely to give you indigestion. Basically, peasant dinner was bread with bread, served alongside more bread. If you were rich, dinner was more extravagant, but also far riskier. Wealthy households loved serving exotic meats, swan, peacock, venison, even porpoise. Sounds impressive, right? Well, the problem was storage. Remember, no refrigeration, so that fancy roast might have been sitting around a little too long before hitting the table. Guests would often mask the taste of spoiled meat with heavy spices, sugar, or sauces. So yeah, a noble feast might look glamorous, but under all that cinnamon and nutmeg, rotten goose, born AP Petty. Now let's talk about fish. England was a deeply religious country, and church rules demanded eating fish on Fridays and during Lent, which meant huge amounts of the population relied on salted or dried fish. And let me tell you, salted fish is not the delicacy you might think. Imagine chewing on a block of seawater-flavored leather. That's your dinner. And if it hadn't been salted enough, well, food poisoning was just waiting to ruin your night. And don't even think about dessert. Sugar was incredibly expensive, imported from far away, and only the rich could afford it. But here's the twist. They ate so much sugar that their teeth literally rotted out of their mouths. Black, decayed, painful stumps. In fact, having rotten teeth was almost a status symbol. It meant you could afford sugar. Meanwhile, peasants with relatively healthy teeth from eating plain bread and vegetables were considered lower class. Imagine being jealous of cavities. That's Tudor logic for you. And remember how kids drank ale instead of water? Well, they also ate the same food as adults. No baby food, no picky eaters menu. A 5-year-old would be gnawing on the same hard bread crust as their parents, and if they choked, well, tough luck. Medicine couldn't save them anyway. By the end of the day, your stomach is a battlefield. Maybe you're bloated from salted meat. Maybe you've got cramps from contaminated vegetables. Maybe the ale gave you a headache. Or maybe, if you're unlucky, the food you just ate is about to kill you within the week. Welcome to Tudor dining, where every meal is both necessary and potentially lethal, so the next time you complain about your fast food order being wrong, just remember, at least it won't give you dysentery. Probably so. You've survived breakfast, dodged food poisoning at lunch, and somehow made it to the heart of the Tudor day. Congratulations, you're tougher than most. But don't celebrate yet, because now comes the real grind. Work. And trust me, Tudor work made your office job look like a spa retreat. Let's start at the bottom, with the peasants. The vast majority of people in Tudor England were peasants, and their lives revolved around one thing: survival. Their job description was basically do whatever it takes to keep food on the table. That meant farming, planting, weeding, harvesting, and tending animals, often from dawn until dusk. And this wasn't gentle gardening in a cozy backyard. This was back-breaking labor in mud, cold, and rain, with tools so crude you'd laugh at them today. Imagine trying to plow an entire field with nothing but a wooden stick and some oxen who absolutely hate you. If you were a man, your day might be spent swinging a scythe until your hands blistered, hauling sacks of grain, or trying to repair tools that broke every other day. If you were a woman, congratulations, you got to do all that, plus manage the household. Cooking, cleaning, brewing ale, spinning thread, weaving cloth, raising children, hauling water, nursing the sick. Tudor women were basically the overworked, underpaid superheroes of the village. And then there were the children. Forget school buses and lunchboxes. Most kids started working as soon as they could walk. Some helped in the fields, some were sent off as apprentices, and others worked as servants in wealthier homes. Childhood wasn't about toys and cartoons, it was about carrying buckets, scrubbing floors, and being yelled at by adults who were just as miserable as you were. And remember, accidents were common. One slip with a blade, one tumble into the well, and boom, life over. Now, let's talk about class, because Tudor England was obsessed with it. The society was structured like a giant pyramid. At the very bottom, peasants, scraping by. Above them, craftsmen and tradesmen, blacksmiths, bakers, carpenters. They worked brutally long hours, but at least they weren't starving all the time. Then came the merchants, who actually made money and started rising in status during this period. Above them, of course, was the gentry landowners, who didn't farm themselves, but enjoyed the profits from others' labor. And towering over everyone else, the nobility, lords, ladies, dukes, duchesses, people who wore silk while you wore rags. People who held feasts while you gnawed on stale bread. But here's the twist, even their lives weren't exactly easy. Sure, they didn't shovel manure, but they lived under constant political pressure, fear of disease, and a very real risk of being executed if they upset the king. Tudor England was basically the kind of place where one wrong word at dinner could get your head chopped off by morning. So yeah, different problems, but still deadly ones. And speaking of problems, let's not forget the working conditions. Imagine being a blacksmith, standing in front of a blazing fire all day with no safety equipment. Or being a miner, crawling through narrow tunnels with only a candle for light, choking on dust, and praying the ceiling didn't collapse on you. Workplace accidents weren't just possible, they were expected. Lose a finger, shrug it off. Break a leg, good luck, because now you're unemployed and probably starving. But here's the thing, despite the misery, work wasn't optional. The Tudor world ran on sheer human labor. No machines, no shortcuts. If you stopped working, you stopped eating. And if you stopped eating, well, you didn't last long. Alright, so now let's zoom in on the daily grind from a different angle. Not just what people did, but how they felt doing it. Spoiler, tired, sore, and constantly worried about money. For peasants, life was basically a cycle of debt and dependency. They didn't own their land, it belonged to the local lord, which meant that every year, no matter how good or bad the harvest was, peasants had to hand over a chunk of their crops as rent. Imagine working 12-hour days, only to give away the fruits of your labor to some rich guy in a castle. And if you couldn't pay, you risked fines, punishment, or losing your tiny strip of land altogether. Tradesmen and apprentices had it slightly better, but it wasn't glamorous. Apprenticeships could last 7 years, during which time you basically worked for free while being bossed around. Masters promised to feed and house you, but feed often meant thin stew, and house meant sharing a bed with 2 other smelly boys. Oh, and beatings, totally normal. Getting smacked around by your master was considered part of the training. Congratulations, you're learning life skills and trauma at the same time. The middle classes, merchants and shopkeepers, were starting to gain influence in Tudor England, especially in towns. They had more freedom, could make real money, and sometimes even bored their way into the gentry. But they still lived with daily risks, fires, disease, outbreaks, and sudden changes in law. One plague wave through your town and poof, your whole business gone. Now, let's check back in with the nobility. On paper, their lives sound amazing. Lavish banquets, silk clothes, servants doing all the dirty work. But here's the secret. Nobles were basically prisoners of their own status. They were constantly involved in politics, constantly expected to show loyalty to the king, and constantly paranoid about betrayal. One day you're in favor, sipping wine in the royal court. The next, you're being dragged to the Tower of London. Henry VIII alone had dozens of people executed, including 2 of his own wives. So yeah, maybe having land and money wasn't all that relaxing. And across all classes, one thing united everyone: exhaustion. Whether you were a peasant in the fields, a servant scrubbing floors, or a nobleman stressing over court politics, life in Tudor England wore you down. People aged fast. A man of 40 often looked 60. Women were often worn out by repeated pregnancies. Kids carried the burdens of adulthood before they even hit their teens. Work wasn't just something you did, it was the air you breathed, the rhythm of your existence, the thing that kept you alive but also slowly killed you. So by the time evening rolled around, the average Tudor was tired, muscles sore, stomach half empty, mind weighed down with worry. And the cruel part, tomorrow, you had to do it all over again. Medicine and diseasing. Imagine this, you're lying on a straw mattress in a dim Tudor cottage. Your chest feels heavy, your skin is burning hot, and every breath rattles like broken bellows. In 2025, you'd grab your phone, call an ambulance, maybe even complain about the hospital Wi-Fi. But in Tudor England, congratulations, you're about to meet a doctor who thinks your yellow bile is too high and might try to fix you by draining a pint of your blood with a rusty blade. Welcome to Tudor medicine, a place where science hasn't exactly arrived yet, and disease is everywhere, sometimes lurking in the air, sometimes carried by fleas, sometimes hiding in your neighbor's cough. If you thought surviving a normal Tudor morning was hard, wait until you catch even a minor illness. Doctors, barbers, and butchers in disguise. First thing you need to know, Tudor doctors weren't like doctors today. Forget sterile white coats, stethoscopes, and years of medical school. These guys were more like philosophers who read old dusty books written by Greek and Roman scholars thousands of years earlier. The main medical theory, the 4 humours. According to them, your body was filled with 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black. By Lillo, by Lif, you got sick. It wasn't because of germs or viruses. Those weren't even discovered yet. Nope, it was because your humours were imbalanced. Too much black bile, you'd get depression. Too much yellow bile, you were angry and feverish. Too much blood, headaches, fevers, basically anything. Their solution: balanced the humors, and the easiest way to do that was to get rid of some of your fluids. Enter the barber surgeon. These guys weren't just cutting hair, they were cutting flesh. Need a tooth pulled? Go to the barber. Need an arm chopped off? The barber again. Feeling unwell? He'd whip out a leech or a razor and drain your blood into a bowl. The same guy who trimmed your beard last week might be sawing off your infected foot today, using the same tools. Sanitization. Forget it. The idea of washing hands between patients would have sounded laughable. And the worst part, people trusted them, because in a world with almost no real cures, even a little showmanship looked like expertise. Weird cures and superstitions. But maybe you couldn't afford a barber surgeon. Maybe you lived in the countryside. In that case, your best bet was a wise woman or a local healer, and their remedies, equal parts creative and terrifying. Got a headache? They might tie a live pigeon to your head because the bird would draw out the pain. Stomachache? Swallow powdered toad bones. Fever? Drink a potion made from boiled horse dung. Yes, horse dung. People actually believed it could rebalance your insides, and if you were unlucky enough to catch something truly nasty. Many cures involved astrology. Doctors would literally check the alignment of the planets before deciding on your treatment. If Mars was in the wrong place, they might delay your surgery. Charms and amulets were also common. People wore little pouches filled with herbs, or even dead animals' body parts, believing these would ward off illness. Spoiler, they didn't. But when half the town is coughing up blood, you'll try anything beat the monsters. Tudor diseases. Now, let's talk about the real killers, because Tudor England was basically one giant petri dish. Crowded towns, open sewage, poor diets, animals everywhere. It was the perfect breeding ground. The plague, the Black Death, never truly disappeared. In Tudor times, outbreaks still swept through England, wiping out entire neighborhoods. People believed bad air, or miasma, carried it. Houses with plague victims were boarded up, sometimes with the sick people still inside, left to die alone. Imagine waking up to pounding on your door, only to realize it's the authorities nailing it shut from the outside. Smallpox, red oozing blisters, high fever, a terrifying death rate. Smallpox was the curse of every Tudor family. If you survived, congratulations, you'd probably be scarred for life. Your face permanently marked. Queen Elizabeth I herself caught smallpox in 1562 and barely lived. She recovered, but her skin was badly damaged, so she wore thick makeup for the rest of her life. Sweating sickness, this one was uniquely English. You'd feel fine in the morning, then suddenly be overcome with chills, body aches, and a fever. Within hours, you'd start sweating uncontrollably, and by nightfall, dead. Even nobles and kings weren't safe. Henry VIII's court lived in constant fear of it. Tuberculosis and other killers called consumption. Tuberculosis wasted away entire families. Add in dysentery from dirty water, syphilis from not-so-safe nights, and ergot poisoning from rotten bread, and you had a whole buffet of ways to die before 30. The human costs. So what did all this mean for ordinary Tudor life? Constant fear. Imagine your neighbor coughing and instantly worrying if your entire household would be next. Parents watched children die of fevers they couldn't even name. Women often died in childbirth, sometimes from infection, sometimes from the midwife's unwashed hands. Death was so common it became normal. Cemeteries filled up faster than they could dig graves. People slept with herbs under their pillows, avoided strangers, or fled to the countryside at the first rumor of sickness. Yet, no matter where you went, disease was already there, waiting. Humor of survival. It's tempting to laugh at some of these cures now. Imagine going to the doctor with a sore throat, and he prescribes ground up emeralds mixed with vinegar, or someone telling you to sniff a dead animal to drive out bad spirits. But for Tudors, this was life and death. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no real understanding of germs, just prayers, potions, and a lot of misplaced confidence. And if you were unlucky enough to end up in a Tudor hospital, let's just say your chances of walking out alive were lower than your chances of catching something new inside. Conclusion to Part 1. SO in Tudor England. Medicine wasn't really medicine, it was guesswork with a side of superstition. Diseases ruled the streets, and cures were often worse than the sickness itself. Surviving even a mild infection felt like a miracle, and we're only halfway through the nightmare, because in part 2, we'll go deeper into plague houses, the rise of quack doctors, and how Tudor England's desperate fight against disease shaped the world we live in today. Picture this: you're dragged into a Tudor hospital. You imagine clean sheets, kind nurses, maybe even soup. Instead, you walk into a filthy hall that smells like sweat, urine, and rotting flesh. Beds, straw piles, doctors, the only people here are monks, nuns, or desperate helpers who know little more than you do. Congratulations, you've officially checked into a Tudor death house. Hospitals, houses of the dying in Tudor times. Hospitals weren't really for curing the sick. Their main purpose, sheltering the poor, caring for travelers, or giving the dying a place to spend their final days. If you went in with an illness, chances were slim you'd walk out again. There were no sterilized instruments, no anesthesia, no antibiotics. Surgery meant strapping you down and cutting quickly before you passed out from the pain or blood loss. Amputations were common, and infection afterward was almost guaranteed. Imagine someone sawing through your leg with no painkillers, just a mug of weak ale to bite on. That was healthcare. Nurses, when they existed, weren't trained professionals. They were often widows, servants, or even prostitutes who took the job because no one else wanted it. And without running water or soap, hospitals were perfect breeding grounds for disease. Childbirth, a gamble with death for women. One of the most dangerous medical events wasn't a plague or a fever, which childbirth. Midwives helped deliver babies, but their tools were basic: cloths, knives, herbs, and prayers. Complications like breech births, hemorrhages, or infections almost always ended in tragedy. There were no C-sections that saved both mother and child. If the baby was stuck, usually either the baby died, or both did. Even when things went smoothly, women often developed deadly fevers afterward, because no one washed their hands or sterilized instruments. Infant mortality was staggering. Some families didn't even bother naming a baby until it survived a year, because the odds of losing it were so high. Imagine living in a world where burying your newborn was considered normal. STDs and silent killers. Tudor England wasn't just about political intrigue and royal banquets, it was also full of sexually transmitted diseases. Syphilis, for example, was rampant. The symptoms were horrifying: painful sores, rashes, eventual madness, and death. Treatments: mercury ointments, which poisoned patients almost as much as the disease itself. People literally died drooling and shaking from mercury poisoning, while doctors proudly announced they were cured. Then there were the less obvious killers: malnutrition and bad diets. A lack of fresh fruit and vegetables caused scurvy. Dirty water spread dysentery. Tooth decay was another nightmare. Sugar was becoming more popular among the wealthy, and without dental care, their teeth blackened, rotted, and fell out. If you've ever had a toothache, imagine living with one that never went away. Fear of the invisible enemy. What made Tudor medicine especially terrifying was that nobody really understood disease. Germs were unknown. Instead, people blamed bad air, sin, or even witchcraft. If your cow died suddenly, maybe your neighbor cursed it. If your child wasted away, maybe God was punishing you. This fear often led to brutal cures. Suspected witches were executed for causing illness. Villagers chased out families they thought carried disease. People burned herbs in their homes, carried flowers to sniff on the street. Remember Ring Around the Rosie? That rhyme comes from plague times, or war charms against evil spirits. Of course, none of it worked. But when death could strike at any moment, even false hope was better than none. Quack doctors and miracle sellers. Wherever there's fear, there's money to be made. And in Tudor England, quacks thrived. Traveling doctors sold miracle potions made of snake oil, ground-up gems, or exotic herbs. They promised instant cures for everything from baldness to bubonic plague. People bought them anyway, because what else could they do? Imagine being desperate, your child dying in bed, and some man offers you a potion straight from the Holy Land for a handful of coins. Even if it was just colored water, you'd probably try it. Some remedies were harmless, others were deadly. Lead, mercury, arsenic poisons were often mixed into medicines, slowly killing the patient. But the salesman, he was long gone before anyone realized the grim numbers. So how bad was it really? Let's break it down. Life expectancy in Tudor England was around 35 to 40 years. Not because everyone dropped dead at 40, but because so many children died young that it dragged the average down. If you survived childhood, you might live into your 60s, but that was rare. Child mortality, roughly 1 in 3 children, died before their 5th birthday. Plague outbreaks could wipe out up to a third of a town's population in a single year. Women faced a 1 in 20 chance of dying in childbirth. For every pregnancy, every Tudor lived with death as a constant companion. Cemeteries filled up quickly. Mass graves became normal, and families often raised more funerals than feasts. Modern comparison, dark humor. It's almost funny if you time traveled back to Tudor England with just a modern first aid kit. You'd be hailed as the greatest doctor alive. Imagine curing infections with a single antibiotic pill while everyone else is still rubbing onions on wounds. A bottle of ibuprofen would make you look like a miracle worker. Even basic soap could save lives. Think about it. Today, if you wake up with a sore throat, you whine, "Ugh, I can't go to work." In Tudor England, you'd whisper, "Ugh, I might not survive the week." Social life, religion, and theory. Imagine this. You're walking through a Tudor village. The church bell is ringing. Children are chasing chickens down a muddy lane. And neighbors are already whispering about who didn't show up at Mass this morning. In Tudor England, your social life, your religion, and even your deepest fears were all tangled together like a giant knot of gossip, prayer, and paranoia. The beating heart of social life. The church, first and foremost. Religion was everything. Forget nightclubs, Netflix, or WhatsApp groups. The local parish church was your social media, your neighborhood group chat, and your weekend entertainment rolled into one. Sunday service wasn't optional. If you skipped, people noticed and you risked being fined or worse. Sermons weren't just spiritual lectures. They were also announcements, politics, and the Tudor version of breaking news. Want to know who got married, who died, or who owed taxes? The church told you. And it wasn't just about prayer. Churches hosted festivals, feasts, and gatherings. Weddings were community events, with dancing, music, and endless ale. Baptisms were excuses for massive celebrations. Even funerals became social occasions, though, with how often people died. Sometimes it felt like the community spent more time at burials than parties. Religion as a weapon. But Tudor religion wasn't just about comfort and community, it was about power. Henry VIII had torn England away from the Catholic Church, making himself head of the Church of England. That single act shook society to its core. Overnight, loyalty to the Pope could mark you as a traitor. Priests were forced to swap their Latin prayers for English ones. Monasteries were dissolved, their treasures stripped, and their monks cast out. Ordinary people were caught in the middle. One year, Catholicism was safe. The next, it was treason. Under Mary I, Protestants were burned alive as heretics. Under Elizabeth I, Catholics faced fines, imprisonment, or worse. Imagine not even knowing if the way you prayed would get you executed. That was daily life in Tudor England. Festivals and community joy. Despite the fear, people still found reasons to celebrate. May Day, harvest festivals, Saints' Days were excuses to eat, drink, dance, and forget for a little while that plague, poverty, or religious persecution might strike tomorrow. Games, music, and theatre also flourished. Bear-baiting pits, cockfights, and travelling entertainers filled towns with noise. By the late Tudor period, Shakespeare and his plays were dazzling audiences in London. Even the poorest villagers found joy in storytelling. Music played on fiddles or flutes, and rowdy games on village greens. Social life wasn't just about survival. It was about carving moments of laughter and community in a brutal world. The shadows of fear. But behind the dancing and festivals lurked constant fear. Disease, famine, and war were always threats. Religious spies lurked in communities, watching for signs of wrong faith. Witches were hunted, tried, and executed just because a neighbor's cow died or a child fell ill. Superstition ruled daily choices. People avoided walking past graveyards at night, believed fairies could steal their children, and carried charms to protect themselves from the devil. Fear wasn't just personal. It was woven into the very structure of Tudor society. So in Tudor England, social life meant gatherings, gossip, and grand festivals, but it also meant living under the constant weight of religion and fear. Your community could lift you up, but it could just as quickly turn against you. You're sitting in a crowded tavern, sharing ale with neighbors. Everyone's laughing, but underneath the cheer there's a tension. Because in Tudor England, what you said or even what you believed could easily cost you your life. Fear of religion and by its spies everywhere after Henry VIII's break from Rome. Religion wasn't just a matter of faith, it was a test of loyalty. Every sermon, every prayer, every word had political weight. Under Elizabeth I, the government even employed spies who lurked in churches, markets, and taverns to listen for whispers of Catholic loyalty or treasonous talk. Imagine you're drunk and ranting about missing the Pope next thing you know. Your words are reported, and you're dragged off to prison. Even neighbors and family could turn informer, not always out of loyalty, but out of fear. The safest strategy: keep your head down, nod in agreement, and never trust anyone too much. Witch hunts and superstition. Tudor England was also a land of deep superstition. If your cow died, if crops failed, if your baby got sick, someone must have cursed you. And who better to blame than the old widow down the lane who muttered strange words and lived alone? Accusations of witchcraft exploded in the Tudor period. Women and sometimes men were dragged to court, tortured into confessions, and executed. Common evidence included having a mole or birthmark called a witch's teat, keeping a cat or toad as a pet said to be a familiar, or simply being disliked by neighbors. These witch trials weren't just about fear of the devil, they were also about controlling communities. Blaming witches gave people an explanation for suffering they couldn't understand. Punishments and public fear. Social life also meant public punishments. Stocks and pillories stood in town squares, where criminals or just unlucky gossips were locked up for everyone to mock, spit on, or throw rotten vegetables at. Executions were massive public events, drawing huge crowds. Imagine seeing someone hanged or beheaded as casually as we'd watch a football match today. It was entertainment, fear, and warning all rolled into one. For the Tudors, justice wasn't about rehabilitation, it was about public terror. Everyday social control. Religion wasn't the only tool of control. Gossip itself was dangerous. If someone accused you of being lazy, immoral, or disloyal, it could destroy your life. Women were especially vulnerable. Accused of scolding or speaking too freely, they could be punished with a device called a scold's bridle, a metal cage locked over their head and mouth. So social life wasn't just parties and prayers, it was a minefield. One wrong step, one wrong word, and your reputation, or even your life, was over. Festivity versus fear. And yet, somehow, Tudor people found ways to live, laugh, and celebrate. They danced around maypoles, cheered at plays, drank at taverns, and gathered for harvest feasts. The joy and the terror were inseparable. Life was short, often brutal, but they embraced whatever moments of pleasure they could find. It's this tension between community and control, joy and fear, that defined Tudor social life. In Tudor England, your social world was a balancing act. Religion gave structure, festivals gave joy, but fear was always lurking. Fear of witches, of spies, of gossip, of God himself. Life was communal, vibrant, and deeply human, but it was also shadowed by constant suspicion. To survive socially, you needed not just friends and family, you needed luck, silence, and sometimes a very good poker face. The sun sinks behind the crooked rooftops of Tudor England. Smoke drifts from chimneys, the streets turn dark, and the air grows damp and heavy. For us, evening means Netflix, hot tea, and a comfy bed. For a Tudor, evening and night meant danger, superstition, and survival. Home life after sunset has daylight. Faded, families huddled inside their homes. Candles and rushlights gave dim, flickering light, but they were expensive, so most people preferred to sit in near darkness. A fire might glow in the hearth, but smoke often filled the room, stinging eyes and lungs. Imagine trying to read, sew, or even eat by the glow of a tiny tallow candle that smelled like rancid fat. Beds were shared sometimes by entire families. Parents, children, and even servants might all cram into one large bed, partly for warmth, and partly because there simply wasn't space. Privacy didn't exist. If you were lucky enough to be wealthy, you might have curtains around your bed. For the poor, it was just straw mattresses on the floor, crawling with lice, fleas, and the occasional rat. The fear of the dark for Tudors. Nighttime wasn't just inconvenient, it was terrifying. Streets had no lights. Villages and towns fell into complete blackness, broken only by the moon or lanterns carried by night watchmen. Step outside after dark, and you risked robbers, wild animals, or worse, spirits and witches. Superstition was strong. People believed the devil roamed more freely at night, and ghosts or fairies might snatch wandering souls. Many households hung protective charms over doors or kept iron objects nearby to ward off evil. Sleepwalking, that wasn't just odd, it was seen as a sign of possession. Even simple illnesses felt more threatening at night, without doctors, medicine, or light. A sick child's cries or a neighbor's cough echoed like death's warning. Crime and danger after dark. If you absolutely had to go out at night, you weren't alone for long. Thieves prowled the streets, especially in larger towns like London. Highwaymen and robbers lurked outside city walls. Night watchmen patrolled with lanterns and halberds, shouting the hour. But they were just as likely to be drunk as they were to be helpful. Brothels, taverns, and gambling dens thrived after sundown. These places were rowdy, dangerous, and often centers of crime. Violence was common. Picture stepping into a tavern, the air thick with ale and sweat, the sound of dice and shouting, and the very real possibility of a knife fight breaking out. In the corner, for women especially, night was perilous. Walking alone risked not just robbery but assault and accusations of immorality. Respectable women avoided being outdoors after sunset unless accompanied. The night watch and curfews in many towns. Curfews were enforced. Bells rang to signal the end of the day, and gates were locked. Anyone caught outside without good reason risked arrest or punishment. Night watchmen carried lanterns, checking doors to make sure they were locked, and sometimes shouting out the time and weather. Imagine trying to sleep while a man outside your window yells, "It's past 10 of the clock, and a storm is coming." Nightly routines and survival tricks inside. Families tried to stay safe. Doors were barred with wooden beams, windows shuttered tightly. Food scraps were cleared away to avoid attracting pests. The fire was banked low to last until morning. Important, because starting a new fire without flint or matches wasn't easy. Before bed, prayers were said not just for thanks, but for protection. Death in the night was common, whether from sudden illness, fire, or accidents. People genuinely feared they might not wake up. That's why the phrase, "Now I lay me down to sleep," carried such weight. Night was a gamble. Wealthier Tudors had servants who slept nearby to guard and assist. Poorer families relied on luck, charms, and communal closeness. Children often drifted off to sleep listening to folk tales of ghosts, saints, and devils, bedtime stories that mixed comfort with warning. Sleep, broken and uneasy sleep itself, wasn't like ours today. Without artificial light, people went to bed soon after dark, but often in two phases. Historians call this segmented sleep. Tudors might sleep for a few hours, wake around midnight to pray, think, or even visit neighbors, then return to bed until dawn. The silence of the night was broken by whispered prayers, muttered fears, and the occasional howl of dogs outside. Dreams were taken seriously. A nightmare wasn't just bad sleep, could be a spiritual warning or a sign of demonic influence. People might wake in terror, convinced something sat on their chest. What we call sleep paralysis, they called the work of witches or night demons. So in Tudor England, surviving the night wasn't about cozy blankets and a Netflix binge. It was about battling darkness, fear, and danger. The home became a fortress, the bed a shared refuge, and prayers a shield against the unknown. Every sunset was a reminder. The world outside was unpredictable, and the night was a time when human threats, disease, and supernatural fears all came alive. For the Tudors, making it to morning was never guaranteed, and waking up to another day was itself a small miracle. Oialty, an mobility optional segment. While most Tudors were busy surviving dirt, disease, and dark nights, a tiny slice of society lived in glittering halls, feasting under candlelight, and wearing clothes worth more than an entire village. Welcome to the world of Tudor royalty and nobility, a life that seemed dazzling, but came with its own deadly risks. Life at court. The royal court was the beating heart of power. Picture the grand palaces, Hampton Court with its vast kitchens and gardens, or Whitehall, echoing with music and gossip. The court wasn't just where the king or queen lived, it was the center of politics, fashion, and ambition. Nobles traveled to court not just for fun, but for survival. Your status, your land, your very life could depend on how close you were to the monarch. One smile from the king could make you rich. One frown could send you to the Tower of London. Fashion and wealth. If peasants wore scratchy wool, The nobility dripped with silk, velvet, and fur. Clothes weren't just fashion, they were law. Literally, sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what. A poor farmer couldn't wear silk even if he somehow afforded it. Only nobles could flaunt the richest fabrics and jewels. Men strutted in padded doublets, feathered hats, and glittering chains. Women dazzled in gowns with stiff collars, elaborate embroidery, and pearls sewn into their hair. But beauty came at a cost. Dresses were so heavy and stiff, they were nearly impossible to move in, and nobles sometimes fainted from the sheer heat and weight. Feasting and food. While commoners ate dark bread and watery ale, nobles feasted on roasted swan, venison, peacocks, and mountains of meat. Banquets showcased wealth, entire pies with live birds inside. Yes, really, sugar sculptures and spiced wines. But more food didn't mean better health. Rich diets full of meat and sugar caused rotten teeth, gout, and digestion problems. Ironically, peasants with their simple bread and vegetable diets sometimes fared better. Power and paranoia. Being noble wasn't all fun and feasts. It was dangerous. Court was a place of endless intrigue. One whisper of treason, one wrong alliance, and you could be executed. Look at Anne Boleyn. She rose from lady-in-waiting to queen, only to be beheaded. Thomas More, once Henry VIII's trusted advisor, lost his head for refusing the king's new church. Nobles lived in a constant balancing act. Flattered the monarch, stay loyal, and pray you weren't on the wrong side of history. Even the monarchs themselves weren't safe. Henry VIII was paranoid, changing wives and ministers like gloves. Elizabeth I surrounded herself with spies to ensure loyalty. Nobility meant privilege, but it also meant living under a sword that could fall at any moment. The burden of duty. Nobles weren't free to just lounge around. They were expected to serve the monarch, leading armies, managing lands, and enforcing royal laws. Their estates were huge, filled with tenants and servants, but managing them was a constant struggle of taxes, debts, and rebellions. Marriage wasn't about love, but power. Noble families arranged unions to strengthen alliances, secure wealth, or climb higher at court. A noble child's future was mapped out long before they were old enough to understand it. Luxury versus furious. Nobles had silk sheets, golden goblets, and vast banquets, but they also lived under constant fear of disease, assassination, or royal Palaces weren't hygienic. Latrines overflowed. Fleas and lice spread everywhere, and outbreaks of plague didn't care whether you wore velvet or rags. And then there was the stress of status. Nobles competed endlessly for attention, power, and influence. Falling out of fashion could be social death. Falling out of favor with the monarch, literal death. So while the peasants struggled with mud, hunger, and survival, the nobility sparkled in jewels and silk. But their world wasn't as glamorous as it looked. Life at the top meant privilege, yes, but also paranoia, pressure, and politics sharp. Enough to kill. In Tudor England, whether you were a peasant in a thatched hut or a duke in a palace, survival was never guaranteed. The difference was simple. Peasants feared hunger and disease, while nobles feared daggers, betrayal, and the wrath of the crown. You've made it through the mud, the hunger, the filthy ale, and even the night full of rats and thieves. You've dodged the barber surgeon's rusty knife, survived plague season, and managed not to annoy the king. Congratulations, you're alive in Tudor England. But hold up. Survival here isn't a marathon, it's Russian roulette. Death could come at you from 100 directions, and most of them weren't glamorous. Disease that lurks everywhere. The deadliest trigger was invisible. One sneeze in a crowded market, and you might be doomed. Plague, smallpox, typhus, tuberculosis, steak, your pick. Even something we'd shrug off today, like a cut on your hand, could fester into a death sentence. Imagine slicing your finger while chopping onions. Today, a band-aid. Back then, infection, fever, delirium, and maybe a priest at your bedside, whispering last rites. Death wasn't an if, it was a when. The food that kills you dinner wasn't just risky, it was a gamble. Undercooked meat, moldy bread laced with fungus, or water that doubled as a sewage cocktail could end you overnight. Wealthy, congratulations, you're at risk of gout, kidney stones, and choking on a roasted swan bone. Poor, you might starve to death or slowly waste away from malnutrition. Every bite was Russian roulette. Your treat of fresh cheese could carry parasites. Your ale might be watered down with something poisonous. Even your saltfish could rot in the barrel. In Tudor England, the table was as much a battlefield as the street. Violence and punishment step out of line, and death didn't wait for disease. It came with steel. Crime was punished brutally. Hangings, beheadings, burnings. And it wasn't just criminals speak against the monarch, challenge the church, or even spread rumors, and you could lose your head. Even ordinary fights could be fatal. Knives and cudgels were everywhere. Tempers were short, and medical care was non-existent. One bar brawl could leave you bleeding out on the floor, while everyone else went back to drinking. Childbirth and family death for women. Childbirth was one of the biggest killers. No anesthesia, no clean tools, no antibiotics, just pain, blood, and prayer. Many mothers and babies never survived the process. Families expected death as part of daily life. You could lose half your children before they reached adulthood. Parents didn't just fear death, they lived with it at their own table. The unseen, everyday killer's fire was a constant threat. Homes were made of timber and thatch, and one tipped candle could burn a whole street. Work accidents were common. Farmers trampled by oxen, fishermen drowning, servants crushed in kitchens. Even the weather was dangerous. Freezing winters, damp chills, or heat waves that spoiled food. And then there were the small killer's lice spreading disease, rotten teeth turning septic, and even sleep itself. Go to bed healthy, wake up dead. The big picture here is the grim reality. Life expectancy in Tudor England hovered around 35 to 40 years. Surviving to old age was so rare. People thought those who did were touched by God. Childhood, childbirth, infection, famine, crime, every part of existence pulled the trigger, sooner or later. For the Tudors, death wasn't a distant concept. It was a neighbor, a dinner guest, a shadow at the end of every day. It shaped how they lived, how they prayed, and how they saw the world. So if you'd been born in Tudor England, the question wasn't, will you survive? The question was, which death trigger will get you first? Disease, hunger, violence, fire, or maybe just the bad luck of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. In this world, life was cheap, death was certain, and survival itself was the greatest miracle of all. So, after walking a day in Tudor shoes, how do you feel? Maybe itchy, dirty, a little hungry, and probably terrified. That's because Tudor life wasn't just history, it was survival training. Every sunrise was a gamble, every meal a risk, and every word a potential death sentence. And yet, they lived. They laughed at festivals. They danced on May Day. They drank bad ale together in smoky taverns. And they cheered at Shakespeare's plays. Their lives were short, but they were vivid. That's the strange magic of Tudor England. It was brutal and beautiful at the same time. Disease lurked in every cough, yet art and culture blossomed. Punishments were savage, yet love letters still passed in secret. Children died young, yet families still dreamed of a better tomorrow. Now think about your own day. You've got clean water, food that usually won't kill you, antibiotics, light at the flick of a switch, and Netflix instead of gossip by the fire. Compared to the Tudors, you're basically royalty. But maybe, just maybe, we've lost something too. When life is guaranteed, maybe it loses some of that raw intensity. The Tudors woke up every day not knowing if they'd see tomorrow, and that made every moment count. So next time you complain about slow Wi-Fi, remember, at least you're not drinking ale because the water is full of sewage. Life in Tudor England was short, dirty, and often terrifying, but it was life lived fiercely. And maybe, just maybe, that's the part worth remembering.